Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm working on a pair of my spindler socks, and since this pattern features cables, I thought it would be a great time to discuss the different styles of cable needles. No cable needle is necessarily better than the others. It's often a matter of personal preference and deciding which type of needle will work best for your project needs. I'll start things off with a confession. Usually when I'm working across small cables, like across 2 to 4 stitches, I usually skip the cable needles completely and just manipulate things with my knitting needles. However, in cases like this, where you're working wider cables across more stitches, a cable needle is going to make rearranging the order of your stitches much easier. And remember, no matter which style of cable needle you prefer, choose a cable needle that has approximately the same size or maybe even a little bit smaller diameter than the knitting needles you're using for your project. Let's take a look at the different cable needle styles. First up, the fishhook shaped cable needle. This is actually the cable needle I learned how to knit cables with. You slip stitches onto the short end of the hook, slide them down to the curve, and then hold the hook either at the back or the front of your work as you are creating your cable, and then you end up knitting your stitches off the long end of the hook. Personally, I think this style is rather dated. Now there are cable needles that are much easier to carry, store, and manipulate than this clunker, but it works just fine, and if you run across one someday in Grandma's knitting tools, at least you'll know what it is. Next, we have bent or curved cable needles. You can slip your stitches onto either end of this needle as you're making your cable, and then slide them down to this bent or curved center section when you're holding the cable needle at the front or the back. You generally don't need to worry about the needle accidentally slipping out of your stitches as you work the cable because this bend helps keep them in place until you're ready to work them. If bent cable needles still feel just a little bit too pokey to you, there are also cable needles that are slightly flared on each end. Since they're completely straight and not quite so pointy, this style can be a little easier to store, especially when you're on the go, but the flare at each end is still going to help keep the needle from zinging out of your stitches when you're actually working your cables. Straight cable needles are basically just short DPNs. They're pointy at both ends, so it's easy to get stitches on and off, but they're straight, so they're a little more compact than the bent version. These may not be the style to start with as you're learning to knit cables because you don't have the protection of the bends or flares to keep your stitches in place as you're cabling. But once you know what you're doing, they could be just what you're looking for because without those bends or flares, the needles can easily slide through your stitches. We don't usually think of them as cable needles, but a spare double-pointed needle or even a circular needle can be used as a cable needle. They're basically the same idea as the straight cable needle, but with a little bit of extra length. DPNs and circular needles generally aren't my first choice when I'm cabling because they are a little bit harder to manipulate than these shorter needles. But there's one exception, and that's when I'm working something like socks with thin yarn and small 2.75 millimeter or smaller knitting needles. In that case, I'll generally just grab a spare DPN that's the same size as the needle I'm using to knit my socks. I hope you enjoyed looking at the different styles of cable needles. There are plenty of options available to help you cross your stitches with ease. If you found this video helpful, please take a moment to give it a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. And if you're inspired to get started on a cable project, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my spindler socks. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!